I have interviewed hundreds of engineers over the years because part of my job is to find and hire the right people. And let me tell you that there are reasons why some engineers perform greatly during interviews, get the job offers, and others might struggle more with interviews. In this video, I will talk about how you could prepare better for interviews, what things to avoid when you're in an interview or preparing for an interview, in addition to some uncommon and unknown tips that will help you prepare better for your next engineering interview. Of course, for those who don't know me, hi, my name is Mohammed Yunus and I work as an engineering director. I like to talk about careers in engineering, and I help coach engineers become more successful in their careers. Now, when it comes to the interviews and how to have a successful interview, think of 3 P's. The first one is preparation. So being prepared for the interview makes a big difference in how you actually perform during the interview. And it might be very common, and a lot of people know that you need to be prepared for the interview, but I will tell you that many engineers come to the interview and get surprised by the questions. Now, this is what we want you to avoid. I don't want you to be in an interview where you are actually taken back by the question, because there is no reason for that. You have to be ready for the questions, and in order to be not surprised by any question in the interview, you have to go and make sure that you cover the main points from the job description. Now, the advertised role will have a job description that includes or lists all the responsibilities and the expectations that you are probably gonna be undertaken when you're hired as part of this role. And this is really a simple thing to do. You could always prepare for examples that you could talk about and explain from your experience and from what you've gone through in your previous jobs about each of those points on the job description. That's just as straightforward as it gets. The second point would be around your CV. Now, you're always going to be asked about your CV. Well, in most cases, at least, the hiring manager or the interviewer will look at your CV and pick some relevant, maybe some points that are interesting for them to ask you about. And that's where, again, you need to be very prepared with what's on your CV. And there's no excuse really for being surprised or not being able to answer about something that you have actually put in your own CV when you're applying for the role. Now, another thing you can prepare for is actually the challenges that you foresee. Another thing that you could be looking at is actually the challenges that you foresee as part of doing that role. And this can come from your experience or from speaking to a mentor or basically reading about the job and anticipating what might be a challenge for you when you're undertaking that role. You gotta be prepared again with the example of similar challenges that you have overcome in the past or lived through in the past. How did you approach them? How did you deal with them? And what was the result or the outcome? Hopefully a successful one. If not, what did you learn from it? And these are all good talking points for you to prepare. Sit before interviews and make a list of these points. And you could always just revise them and revise how you speak in front of the mirror or in front of your mobile phone camera, or even in front of somebody who's a friend or from your family. And that could just give you the rehearsal and the practice necessary to increase that confidence, which leads us to the next area where people really struggle when it comes to interviews, and that's usually around nervousness. And for me, that's an element about preparation. We've covered that, but there's also an element about how you are conducting yourself in the interview. Now, if you feel that you are the type who gets nervous in interviews, that's totally normal, that's totally fine. But at the same time, you gotta be also well prepared for that. You will know more than anyone else about yourself and how you can deal and ease that nervousness. Now, whether you could be arriving early or joining the interview early, you could have a glass of water, you could probably have an icebreaker in the beginning of the interview, maybe crack, of course, an appropriate and a good funny joke, or talk about your day or the weather or something you've been up to in the weekend. Just make it brief and make it as interesting as possible. So you could also ask the interviewer about their day or about their week. Any of those actions can really help you get into the rhythm of a conversation. And that's again something that you have to get help with in terms of looking for ideas on how to ease that nervousness. Now, nervousness for me comes when I am not ready enough or haven't practiced, the answers enough. But the more you practice and the more interviews you get into and the more you learn from it, the more confident you become. So we talked about preparing, we talked about easing that nervousness. Another thing you have to be 100% all the time is honest. When answering questions, you gotta be honest. Don't make up things that you haven't gone through or you haven't experienced. Because the moment you are asked more about it, or when the interviewer tries to probe or query into a little bit more detail and you are then not able to answer, that doesn't reflect well on your performance during the interview. So be honest. Nobody in the world knows everything. Nobody has experience in everything. There's no such thing as the finished article. You have to always be honest, and if you're asked a question that you haven't knowledge of or haven't really got experience with or enough experience with in the past, you could always say that frankly speaking, I haven't come across this before, however, and then you could recall something similar to it, or you could pause for a second, think about how you'd approach it and present that answer. So you could say, I haven't come across this situation in the past, however, if it happens, this is how I would approach it, and why would you pick that answer? So this is really important because it shows that you've got, critical thinking, you've got analytical thinking skills, and these are very, very important. These would add massively to your credit in an interview. We talked about confidence. Of course, it comes from preparation, but you gotta also remind yourself that you have been chosen for the interview. And let me explain something to you that you might not know about, but when you're applying for a role, you're one of many, many, many CVs and resumes that make their way through to the hiring manager and the recruiter. And being invited for an interview means that you're actually there or thereabouts. It's just about confirming that that person is the one who presented their CV and confirming that they just didn't, make up the stuff that they have written on their CV, that they're really genuine. And it's also about checking out your personality and your communication skills. So there's a lot more to be covered and explored in interviews other than your CV. So have confidence, know that you have already achieved the level of success being invited to the interview. Being in the interview means that you are one step further ahead. That should give you more and more confidence. There is no reason to feel less confident about being in the interview because it's only going to get better from here. Now, there are other tips that you need to also make sure that you maintain during the interview. Remember, the interview is a human interaction, so try to be likable, smile, try to maintain eye contact, have an open body language and body posture. So again, these are things that you could research and look into and practice before getting into the interview, because they make all the difference in communicating and putting you across as a confident and trustworthy candidate for the job. The last thing that a lot of people don't really talk about that much is actually post the interview. So that's the last P. We've covered two P's, which are preparation and the performance during the interview. Now, the last P is post interview. And that's very, again, as important, and a lot of people just omit that part, but I'll tell you why it's important. This is because whatever you learn in that stage from the interview and reflect upon post the interview will mean that you actually carry that learning into your next interview. You actually take that forward in your career as well. So these are very, very valuable lessons that you could learn from, and it's very easy to note down after the interview what went well. So that should give you more confidence, and you could now recognize that this is one of your strengths, because it's very, very important for self-awareness as an engineer. To also note what you struggled with or what you felt you haven't prepared well enough for, because these are also important points to look into researching more on and preparing more for the next interview and for the next time. There's always something that you could improve on, and these are the actual points that you could gather as feedback from interviews, just from sitting down in the interview and carrying out answering the questions and having that conversation and dialogue. These are really, really important feedback points that you should note and carefully inspect after having the interview to learn from. People ask for feedback, and that's all well and good. However, recruiters and people nowadays are very busy. They might be also very worried about upsetting somebody with something that could be misunderstood. So people will always give some sort of standard positive feedback. The question becomes, how do you get constructive and useful feedback? You should start by following up after the interview, expressing really gratitude for the opportunity to meet people and talk with the person who's been in the interview with you. And on the other hand, as we said, if you know what areas you struggled with, try to specifically target the question about the feedback from the interview on those areas in particular. You could always say, I really felt that, had a good conversation with you around this part of the project or that part of the design or whatever. However, I really felt that I could do better on 1, 2, 3 points that you have captured during the interview, and you have felt that you might have been hesitant about in the interview or not 100% sure about in the interview. And this is where you get the good feedback. I think you give them an opportunity by making sure that you are very specific about what you ask about, so that you get meaningful and specific feedback as well. And actually that will also reflect very well on you, because they will read that email from you and think, well, actually that person is really interested, he's really genuine, and he really cares, and he's taking the time and effort, he's putting a lot of thought into this, which means that you are a candidate that they would think again of in the future. If you like this video, there is more tips and techniques that help you with preparing for interviews and being successful at interviews and doing better at engineering interviews. And I'll leave the link in the description below for my Substack. You'll find a lot of free resources, a lot of checklists. There are a couple of other videos and articles that would also help you when you're preparing for interviews. Remember, be confident, because you're already invited to the interview, and I wish you all the best. If you have any questions anytime, send them over to me, write them in the comment section, and I would really appreciate it if you engage with this video. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good day.